Thank you both for being here today. I really appreciate it. For our community, I want to let you know that Good Morning is the leading grief and loss podcast, and we have the wonderful Sally and Imogen here. So, ladies, can you please wave so everybody can welcome you? Grief and loss is an issue in the Huntington's community, and we often don't speak about it. So having both of you here, experts in the field, is going to be so beneficial to the community to even understand what grief is, how people define it, and giving permission for people to feel it, to name it, and to discuss it. So I thank you both for being here. Could you possibly introduce yourselves to the community?
Sure. So I'm Sal.
And I'm Im.
And we are the co-founders of Good Morning. Good Morning started out as a podcast to focus on opening up the conversation about grief and loss. We started the podcast in 2020, and it's since grown into a book, into a global community, and just a real movement opening up the conversation about grief and having honest conversations about this experience that we all go through, but sometimes don't feel comfortable or know how to talk about. So yeah, it's a real honor to be here with you today, Tammy. Thank you for having us.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Imogen, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, so Sal and I, we both lost our mums suddenly, only months apart. We didn't actually know each other prior to losing our mums, and we met through a support group. And having someone who understood our experience was so helpful for both of us in grief, because you are right, grief isn't talked about enough. It's one of those things that you can't really prepare yourself for, and then you get thrown into it, and it's such a life-changing experience, and we're not quite prepared for the magnitude of loss. So thank you for having this conversation and helping educate people about the experience of grief.
I think it's wonderful that the two of you were able to connect over a similar experience and be able to support each other. And on that note, I think it leads beautifully into how would you define grief? Because I think traditionally it's always connected with death. But in the Huntington's community, grief takes on many forms. So I'd love to hear from both of you around how you both define it.
Love this question. I'd love to start by actually telling you what the dictionary definition of grief is, which tells us that grief is just intense sorrow, especially caused by someone's death. Grief is so much more than that. And I love that you acknowledge that it's not just for death, loss as well. Like, grief impacts anyone going through any type of loss, and that could be a living loss as well. So the changes to their health, the loss of a house, the loss of a job, a relationship breakdown. So many things can cause us to feel grief and experience grief. And so we've got a few issues with the dictionary's definition, and that is one of them. It's not just caused by death. And also, it's not just intense sorrow. It's not just sadness. It's so many other emotions. We've actually written a whole chapter of emotions in our book, Good Morning, because, that it can come as quite a shock. And another thing that took us both by surprise is how physical grief can be as well, didn't we?
Yeah, grief is it's not just an emotional experience. It's usually physical, it's social, it's mental, it's spiritual, and it's not just felt after a death. So there are a couple of terms that we'd love to share with your community. So there's anticipatory grief, which is the grief that you feel for somebody before they pass away. So it's when you're anticipating a death, and that can be quite common in communities like Huntington's communities, and it can have all of the same similarities as the grief that you feel after someone dies. And like Im was saying, that includes it being emotional, loads of different emotions, but also physical, mental, social. Can be quite isolating if nobody around you is experiencing a similar situation, and they don't understand the grief that you're feeling. But then there's also ambiguous grief. So grief that isn't recognized by society as being a valid form of grief. So, for example, again, it could be if you're caring for a loved one who has a terminal illness or disease, or if you're, a loved one has dementia, and they're still alive, but society doesn't necessarily recognize the grief that you're experiencing. So grief comes in many, many forms. And like Im said, there's living losses as well that so many of us experience throughout life: a relationship breakdown, a redundancy, changes to your future plans. COVID, the pandemic, was a massive one. And a lot of people don't realize that that is grief, and they don't give themselves permission to grieve or to process that grief. So yeah, there's so many levels to it and so many layers to it. But I think that knowing that grief can come in many forms, not just after death, is a really good starting point to become more aware of how to help yourself and others.
I can't thank you both enough for defining grief in those terms. And I know that sounds quite simple, but it isn't, because within, not just with the Huntington's community, you're so right, loss comes in so many forms. And in this community, it could be a loss of a job, a loss of an independence that we all take for granted. It can come in many forms. And by both of you stating that and within your expertise, I think it's very invaluable for this community. And I'm sure for others who will probably listen to this as well. So I can't thank you both enough for defining it and valuing grief in its different forms. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was that a motivating factor for you for both of you to do this podcast?
Definitely, yes. We both struggled to find resources that we could relate to about the reality of grief, and that spoke to, the exhaustion, the brain fog, all of the, the range of things that we can feel when we are experiencing loss in any form. And that was one of the big driving forces, and also just how incredibly lonely grief can feel for people and really isolating. And we were both well supported by our friends and family, and we still felt lonely and isolated, which I think is really important to note here. You can have support and still feel lonely in grief. And yeah, we just wanted to connect with others who understood what we were going through. We wanted to know that this is something that we could survive, because it felt so earth-shattering and turned our worlds upside down, because we weren't prepared for it, and because there aren't many open conversations about the realities of grief. So we didn't know what to expect. So that was definitely one of the big driving forces behind creating Good Morning.
Yeah, and I think our unique twist on things and the way that we like to approach things is with honesty and humor. So when you listen to Good Morning, people might think, oh, a podcast about grief. No, thanks. That's going to be a bit sad and doom and gloom, but it's like listening to any other podcast. We try and bring a little bit of lightness, a little bit of humor into the subject. And that doesn't mean that we're laughing about death all the time, but it's just being really honest, real, personable, and conversational, and just trying to just make the conversation very relatable. And that seems to really resonate with people.
Oh, I don't think anyone could misinterpret both your genuineness, and grief can be humorous as well when you're remembering, or that's part of grief as well, isn't it? Sort of looking at memories and having those times where there was humor. So I think that's a wonderful way to go about it. And because you're both so genuine, I don't think anybody would misinterpret that at all. Where would you suggest people who are listening to this go to for support in relation to grief or loss for them, even if it's the first step?
There are so many amazing resources out there. Since we started the podcast, there's been more and more kind of grief, I guess, resources popping up. But in Australia specifically, obviously the Good Morning podcast, or our Instagram community. It depends. Some people might like to listen to podcasts. Some people might find more comfort just dipping in to Instagram and maybe finding some content that resonates with them and then dipping out. There's Griefline in Australia as well, which is a national grief hotline. It's a free telephone service with professional counsellors, and that can be a really great place to start if you just want to talk to somebody who isn't part of your network or your family, who can be a third party who can just listen and give you guidance. There's also Motherless Daughters Australia, which is a fantastic organisation that supports women and girls who have lost their mums. And Grief Line is also good for anticipatory grief. So you don't have to call Grief Line if you've just experienced a death loss. So for your community in particular, it could be a really safe space to explore some of the complicated feelings that come with grief when we are supporting somebody with a disease that's impacting our lives in many ways.
So would your overall message, and please tell me if I've misread this, is don't sit with that uneasiness. Please reach out and seek support in the way in which you're most comfortable, whether it's through a podcast, whether it's through, Grief Line here. Don't sit with that feeling of loneliness and complexity.
Definitely. Yes, I think that will be the message. And like Sal mentioned, some people might want connection with other people and like that face-to-face interaction, whereas others might like to listen to a podcast in their own time, in their own comfortable space. So it's important to find out what sort of support resonates with you and then to actively go and seek that if you are struggling. Absolutely.
Is there anything else that you feel like I haven't covered that you'd like the community to know before we finish today?
Well, just to flag that we actually did an interview. It would have been in 2021. So we've done about 150 podcast interviews now. So we've got quite a back catalogue. But we did an interview with a lady called Kelly Terranova, whose mum has Huntington disease. And so we did cover the topic. So if you, we'll send the link to you all after this, so you can include that in the resources, because that might be a specifically helpful episode for your community.
Yeah, it's a good episode. And she talks a lot to that anticipatory grief piece about how exhausting it is caring for, someone you love who has got a disease. And so, yeah, it's a good episode and might resonate with your community quite a lot.
I think it will, the anticipatory grief, particularly when you have a genetic illness in the family. So you're not only caring for a loved one, but you're also considering your own genetic status as well. And what does that mean for you in your life? So some of those issues you've already touched on. I think grief and loss in this community is quite significant and quite powerful. And I think you've both given people permission to discuss it. So thank you for that. It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you both. You've been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Lovely to chat.
Thank you. Lovely to connect with you.